Programming does this really weird thing. It gives you just enough early success to think you understand what's happening, right before completely destroying that confidence. And if that happened to you, I want to explain why. Because I think a lot of people get hit by this moment and completely misread what it actually means. At first, coding feels kind of exciting. You learn functions, loops, variables. Then you make something tiny work. Maybe it's ugly, maybe it barely does anything, but it works. At first you think, okay, maybe I get programming, and then somehow everything changes. Now someone's talking about asynchronous code, memory management, architecture, state, dependencies. And suddenly it feels like everyone else joined a completely different conversation, without telling you. And what makes this so frustrating is that it feels backwards, because shouldn't learning more make things feel easier? That's how most of the skills work. If you practice guitar, you slowly sound less terrible. If you go to the gym, the weights that felt heavy eventually don't. Programming feels different. Programming feels like walking into the ocean. At first, it feels easy. You're standing in the shallow water. You feel in control. Then you keep going a little further, and suddenly your feet can't touch the ground anymore. The ocean didn't change. You just reached a different part of it. And I think this is where a lot of people quietly convince themselves they are bad at programming. Because what this feels like is, I was doing well and now I'm lost. But what's actually happening, it's almost the opposite. You finally learned enough to see how much complexity was there the whole time. Which raises a slightly uncomfortable question. Does this ever stop? Like, do experienced programmers eventually reach a point where everything just makes sense? Because I think beginners secretly assume there's some moment where you finally arrive, where you stop feeling confused, where you stop opening documentation every 10 minutes, where weird bugs stop ruining your afternoons. But then you talk to actual experienced developers, and they're still googling things, still getting stuck, still opening code they wrote 6 months ago like someone else broke into their computer. And that's when you realize something kind of weird. Programming doesn't get easier because you finally know everything. It gets easier because you get better at being confused. And I know that sounds like a terrible explanation. So let me explain what I actually mean. Beginners experience confusion like a verdict. Something breaks and you don't know why, and your brain immediately goes, great, I'm bad at this. Experienced programmers get confused too, constantly. The difference is they don't treat confusion like proof they shouldn't be there. They treat it like part of the process. So instead of spiraling, they start narrowing things down. What changed? What assumption am I making? Is this even the real problem? And from the outside that looks like confidence, but most of the time that's just familiarity with uncertainty. And I think this is one of the most misleading things about programming, because when you watch someone experience, it looks like they just know everything. But a lot of what you're actually watching is someone who got less emotionally dramatic about not knowing. And honestly, that changes everything, because if confusion isn't proof you're failing, then what actually separates beginners from experienced programmers? I think it's this. Beginners want certainty, while experienced programmers want signals. A beginner sees an error message and thinks, how do I make this go away? While someone experienced thinks, what is it trying to tell me? A beginner Googles fixes until something works. An experienced developer starts building a theory. What changed? What do I actually know? What can I eliminate? That's not intelligence. That's pattern recognition built through pain. And honestly, that might be the most frustrating part about learning programming. Because the things you need, you can't shortcut. You build it by getting stuck a lot. Which is exactly why programming can feel so emotionally brutal. Because the process that makes you better often feels exactly like the process proving you're bad. And if nobody explains that distinction, it's really easy to quit at exactly the wrong moment. That awful phase where programming suddenly feels impossible, that's usually not the moment you're failing. It's the moment you stop standing in the shallow end.